The season of hard foreign policy issues is back with us. Now, you will be fully within your rights to ask, hey, Shekhar Gupta, you're talking about issues happening across the world all the time: Ukraine, China, Middle East, Africa, Latin America, America, Britain. So, how come you say suddenly the foreign policy season is in? That is the difference. Foreign affairs, world affairs, and foreign policy. When we say the season of foreign policy is in, the implication is we are talking about hard foreign policy issues for India, from India's direct interest or with India's direct participation. Now, two things have happened over the past 48 hours or so as we are talking, as I am recording this, which is on a Friday evening. Now, these two things are: one, the US Congress has passed with a stunning majority, 330 against 99. Stunning majority, an amendment to a US law. This is an amendment to the US National Defense Authorization Act. Now, very loosely, I could say this is like the budget for US defense being passed, the budget for Pentagon being passed, which is something like $800 billion. But the important thing is that in this act, an amendment was moved by Democratic Congressman Rohit Khanna, known as Ro Khanna, 45-year-old from a Hindu Punjabi family whose grandfather actually was Amarnath Vidyalankar, who some of the older people might have heard about. He was one of the colleagues of one of the comrades of Lala Lajpat Rai in the earlier 20th century in the freedom movement. Now, he moved this amendment. Which basically authorizes the US government to lift CAATSA sanctions against India. Now, what is CAATSA? CAATSA is a law. I mean, sometimes laws easily lend themselves to sort of pronounceable acronyms. So, CAATSA is Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, CAATSA, Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. This was brought in much against Donald Trump's opposition, but the Congress was very angry at that point because they thought, one, Russians had got away with annexation of Crimea from Ukraine in 2014, and then there in 2016, the Russians had interfered in a presidential electoral process. So it's Congress, Senate, they had a lot of Democratic members also, and in any case, nobody loves Russia particularly. So this law was passed. Trump had said, by passing this law, you are now narrowing my negotiating options. But the law was passed. What that law means is that if any nation engages in significant trade or relationship, particularly military purchases with three countries, that is Iran, North Korea, and Russia, then US can impose these sanctions on the country that is buying. So, for example, in the past, they have imposed the same sanctions against Turkey, which is a NATO ally, for buying exactly the same thing that India is now buying. India has already got the first unit. India ordered 5 units of the S-400 surface-to-air missile systems. They can counter the threat of both, all kinds of flying targets, from aircraft to missiles. Now, India ordered these in 2018. And since then, this threat of American sanctions has been hanging on India's head, although most people who know better somehow never took this threat seriously. But American political system, you never know. Even I never believed that this would happen, but this was a threat. Now for the Congress to pass it, this is not the end of the road. After the Congress, now Senate has to pass it also. Now, if you see this 330-99, you can't see a different split in the Senate. And then the president has to approve it. Now President Biden will have to get really cross with India over something to not approve it. So I would see it as a done thing. So Ro Khanna, while moving the amendment, said, this amendment is of utmost importance. I'm happy to see it pass in the House on a bipartisan basis. That means almost all of the Democratic congresspersons and a majority of Republicans voted for it. So who are the 90 who voted against it? There's a little tidbit there. Of the 90 who voted against it, only 5 were Democrats. 85 were Republican. Now, I don't know what their issues are. The issues might be something as simple as to say that this is something that has been moved by moved under a democratic administration, because Republicans by and large have been in favor of waiving CAATSA sanctions against India. So Ted Cruz, who's a significant Republican congressman, he wrote a letter in March to President Biden, where he said it will be extraordinarily stupid, extraordinarily foolhardy, his exact words, extraordinarily foolhardy for America to impose sanctions under CAATSA on India. Another Republican Senator, Todd Young, who's also a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he had said in April that if the American government imposes CAATSA sanctions on India, this will undermine the Quad. Nevertheless, 85 Republicans have voted against. Obviously, many more have voted for. Almost all Democrats have, but 5 haven't. And that's a little interesting tidbit that I was talking about. So who are the 5 who haven't? So count the names. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the pictures will run on the screen. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Jamal Bowman, Cori Bush. Now, these 5 have voted against. Who are these 5? These are 5 of the 6 members of what Donald Trump used to call as the squad. So these were the 6 people below 50, young sort of radicals of Democratic Party who had come up and who stood very much on the left of their own party also, kind of a ginger group, or maybe young Turks or whatever. 5 of the 6 have voted against India, which include Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, and of course, Jamal Bowman, also from New York, and Cori Bush from Missouri. If you've seen some of the proceedings on human rights issues, etc., at the Congress, and you go back and watch those videos, you will find that some of these people will also be most vocal against India, or be most critical of India. Now, the only one member of the 6-member squad who voted in favor of the amendment is Ayanna Presley. So the remaining 5 are the only 5 Democratic congresspersons to vote against the amendment. Khanna, born Rohit Khanna, he says my bipartisan amendment marks the most significant piece of legislation for US-India relations out of Congress since the Indo-US nuclear deal. Because this is actually lifting sanctions on India as an ally, when the same sanctions for the purchase of the same system have already been imposed on Turkey. Also in the past, very same sanctions had been imposed or Chinese Ministry of Defense's Equipment Development Department, EDD as it's called, for the purchase of 10 Sukhoi 35 fighters from Russia. Now this is the Equipment Development Department. If they bought 10 Sukhoi 35s, they were not going to make a squadron of 10 Sukhoi 35s and conquer Taiwan with that. They are obviously going to strip them apart and re-engineer or reverse engineer and produce copies, because that's what the Chinese are good at. So they also got sanctioned by the Americans besides Turkey. But India in this case gets an exception, gets a waiver, which is a very important thing. Now see the amendment. I will share a link for the amendment. You can see that. This will also run on my screen as I'm talking. The amendment says, among other things, and I'm abbreviating it, I'm making it as short as possible. It says, number 1, this is section 4.1 in the amendment. It says, a strong US-India defense partnership rooted in shared democratic values is critical in order to advance US interests in the Indo-Pacific. It's the American Parliament. They have to sell it. Khanna has to sell it to his MPs or his members of Congress on the grounds that it's in America's interest. Then it says, this partnership between oldest and largest democracies in the world is critical to countering threats in the Indo-Pacific. Then this amendment mentions something that we haven't talked about very much in India, and maybe at some point I will talk about it in more detail, or I will have one of my colleagues talk about it. That is the new partnership that India and US have announced recently called ICET. What is ICET? This is Initiative on Critical Emerging Technologies. And what these are, you can imagine, but I'll mention some of that as we go along. So the amendment says the Initiative on Critical Emerging Technologies, ICET partnership, is a welcome and essential step as partnerships will now become possible. This will enable partnerships between governments, academia, and industry. So they can all work together in these fields. Next, it says US India advances in artificial intelligence. ICAT, I mentioned to you just now, Initiative on Critical Emerging Technologies. What are these? So specifically, one of these sub-clauses in the amendment says US India advances in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotech, aerospace, and semiconductor manufacturing are vital. And with this, engineers and computer scientists of the two countries, that's what the amendment says, engineers and computer scientists of the two countries will be able to collaborate, work together to create technologies and to give democracies, not just India and America, but all democracies, an edge. In fact, put their technological ability or prowess above Russia plus China. So this is a very interesting amendment that you are being allowed to buy something of critical importance to you and very high tech from Russia, whereas the real objective of the Americans is to produce technologies in partnership with India, which are better than Russia's. But that is how strategic affairs are run. It is hardball. Sometimes, as I use this example in many other situations, sometimes you target one ball, you hit one ball, so it goes and hits the other because that is the one you want to pocket. And that is what's happening right now in this case. Then the amendment also lists 4 things that commend the amendment. That's why the amendment is so important for America and for India. It says India has a persistent security border threat from China. India has to counter it. India also has a historic dependence on Russian weapons. That can't just go away. So America can't punish India for that earlier dependence. Number 3, that America must encourage India to make a transition from Russian systems to other systems. Presumably, they'd like India to buy American systems, but don't forget, in the past decade or so, in fact, just over a decade, India has bought $20 billion of American armament systems. We don't see them all the time because none of them is really a big headline item, but see the C-17, C-130s, now you see the Apaches, the new helicopters for the Navy are coming, M777, howitzers, the same gun, artillery gun that the Ukrainians are using to great effect right now. All of these have come from the Americans out of this $20 billion purchases. And then it says that that's why this amendment will serve the best interests of the US. So that is one part. Second is I2U2. What is I2U2? This sounds almost like, I know U2 was a group, but this almost sounds like some teenagers, some new thing, something like FOMO or something like that. But I2U2, it's another Quad. It was called Quad of the Middle East or the Middle Eastern Quad in October when it was first set up in 2021. And then it sort of lost its way. In fact, when it was called the Middle Eastern Quad, it had got some people a little bit uneasy, including in the Middle East. Because in the Middle East, say Israel, UAE, which are 2 members of this, are very friendly with China. And they never want to be seen at odds with China. Whereas India and America, the other 2, are at odds with China. So I2U2, there are 2 I's here, India first, we first, and Israel, the 2 I's, and the US and UAE, 2 U's. So these 4 have set up a grouping now. In October last year, the 4 foreign ministers had met, and then it had sort of cooled off. And as I mentioned to you, people thought, oh, this was just one of those fancy things. It's been forgotten. But now, with Joe Biden in Israel, in Jerusalem, meeting Yair Lapid, the new Prime Minister of Israel. Summit took place with Joe Biden and Yair Lapid together in Jerusalem, and Modi and UAE's ruler Sheikh Zayed participating virtually. Now, this has done very important things, and this has said very important things. Now, one of the important takeaways we see is from Yair Lapid, who says that, look, you have big formats, big organizations, big bodies. It becomes very difficult to take decisions. A small body like this, a quad like this, is an easy forum to take quick decisions. Anthony Blinken, American Secretary of State, he is the one who's gone so far as to describe it as a West Asian Quad. Some people like to say West Asia, some prefer to say the Middle East. You can make your choice. Now, the important thing there is, the important initiative that's come out is about food and fuel security. Now, UAE, for example, that area, the Gulf area, they don't grow much food. They are very dry. So they depend on food coming from outside, and they see India as a food basket, that India could go grow food for not just them, but for a lot of others. So an initiative has now been signed whereby UAE would be putting up $2.2 billion. That's serious money for agriculture. And this will be to set up agricultural parks all across India. And Joe Biden said at the same summit that with this initiative, with this money, Indian entrepreneurship and Indian diligence, hard work of Indian farmers, and Israeli and American private sector's expertise, you can increase India's food production by 3x in 5 years. And think of what that will mean for India, and think of what that will mean for the rest of the world, which is today, which has been reminded of its vulnerabilities in the area of food after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So Biden said India is a major food producer in the world. And Yair Lapid also said that the idea of a food corridor between India and the Middle East is a very vital idea. So this tells you that this is a very important step in foreign policy as well. Now, everybody in this grouping, as in any other grouping, comes with their own interests. Now, the Americans, Anthony Blinken talked about how India and UAE could both collaborate in easing or hastening Israel's integration in the Middle East. At the same time, the Gulf countries, UAE, Saudi Arabia, they are not so concerned about China as India and America might be, but they are concerned about Iran. And once again, people work on different axes. So while on the one hand, they hope the Americans will give them some kind of security guarantees vis-a-vis Iran, but at the same time, Saudis also recently held their own talks with Iran, brokered by in Baghdad. So all this goes on. This is a very important region. For some time, we've been looking more to our east, particularly because of China. Now, this is also an occasion to look at the West, because in foreign policy today, it's very important to cover as many bases as possible.